Hello, welcome back to the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum virtual speaker series, where we have paleontology guests call in for a presentation on science, fossils, and dinosaurs, and where the public will be able to ask questions live on YouTube after the talk. First off, we want to acknowledge that we are on the homeland of the many diverse First Nation and Métis peoples whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. Today, we have Julius Csotonyi presenting on his topic, Paleoart and Science, Mutually Beneficial Endeavors. Julius is a freelance natural history illustrator and biological science graduate, having achieved a Master of Science in Ecology and Environmental Biology from the University of Alberta and a PhD in Microbiology from the University of Manitoba. He has published scientific papers on mutualisms in Utah and unusual bacteria at alien looking deep ocean hydrothermal volcanic vents. This scientific background and a childhood obsession with drawing dinosaurs has impelled him to strive to restore as realistically as possible the curiously alien environments that Earth has hosted in its deep past. Rapid developments in global communication and travel have substantially raised the value of scientific illustration, especially paleoart, to both scientists and museum exhibit teams because of its potential for effective public outreach. This generates an interesting niche for those with backgrounds in both art and science. Using an image-packed presentation from his experience in paleoart, Julius will discuss the mutual benefits of scientific illustration and scientific investigation to each other. The ways in which he has incorporated paleontology, paleobotany, ecology into his artwork will receive special focus, including mural works he has completed for the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum. Thank you for joining us today, and with that, I'll let Julius take it away.
Thank you very much, Jackson and Emily, and thank you very much to everybody here at the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum for inviting me to do this presentation. It's a great pleasure to be able to come back and contribute to the virtual speaker series at a museum that I've had a pleasure to work with in the past. So again, my name is Julius Csotonyi. I live here in Vancouver on the ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I'm very grateful to be able to share this beautiful place. So so I'm going to share my screen here and get going on the presentation. And here we go. And start the slideshow. Right. Here we go. Okay, good. Hopefully you guys can all see that. So I'm going to be talking about my work as a paleo artist and scientific illustrator, and how I feel like this field of work is mutually beneficial with paleontology in this case, and you can say the same thing about scientific illustration and science in general, I think. Of course, this lead image here, which was the cover of our book with Steve White on the Paleoart of Julius Csotonyi. So kind of my introductory work is not really, doesn't look like a very mutually beneficial kind of interaction there between the Tyrannosaur and the Spinops. But, you know, you can imagine maybe the mother and the baby in that sense kind of benefiting each other in many ways. Anyway, that's kind of we'll talk about sort of this mutual interaction in a second. But what got me into all of this was a fascination with science right from the beginning. I was always interested in science. I wanted to actually become a professor at one point. Science is a toolbox that can take us closer to faraway places that we can't experience in person as easily. So deep time, for example, and this is where paleontology comes in. We can look at things that happened ages and ages ago, much longer than human lifespans, and also to places that are very, very far away. Throughout this, oops, kind of advanced automatically. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be showing artworks that I've completed for various projects. And some of these are done sort of for myself, like these ones here showing the Tycho impact crater and then one of Jupiter's moons, Amalthea. Other ones are for certain projects. So my own background in science started looking at mutualisms. I got into biological science, as Jackson was saying, at the University of Alberta, studying the mutualism between yuccas and yucca moths. which is an obligate mutualism. I also studied how biological soil crusts, which are communities of small organisms that stabilize soil, are impacted by the trampling by large herbivores like elk, and actually are facilitated in Jasper National Park. Then in my PhD, I became more interested in extreme environments, with sort of an interest ultimately propelled by a fascination with the search for life outside of Earth. And I studied hypersaline or highly salty systems in the center of Canada and these salt springs, and also these deep ocean hydrothermal vent ecosystems off the Pacific on our Canadian shores. These are interesting because they're very they look like what you might expect on other planets, these extreme environments with volcanic vents. And they involve some of these instruments that are very complicated and that are all in many ways like spacecraft to be able to find them. It's almost more difficult. It is in some ways more difficult to survive on the ocean floor for somebody like you and me than it is in to be able to access outer space. And so you need these pressure resistant vehicles, for example, to study that. When we went down there with these remote operated vehicles, we found these fascinating environments that have these venting sulfide structures that emit water that can be up to 350 degrees Celsius right into this cold 2-degree ocean water and precipitate out these plumes of smoke-like particulate matter of metal sulfides. And so there's toxic metals there, extremely high temperature. It's often acidic. You got these multiple types of extreme environments. It's very different from what we could experience at most places on the surface. And yet there is life there. So I was involved in looking at the microbiology of these vents and the organisms that live there, and what the kinds of microbes that live on the organisms and in the plume waters and so on. And so that's a picture of me working on the ship, the Thomas G. Thompson, sampling or processing samples of microbial life from the deep ocean. Oops, this kind of sounds ugly. And I was looking at, for example, the way in which microbes resist and transform heavy metals into less toxic forms. Those test tubes in the bottom show colorful ways in which our bacteria were able to detoxify some of these chemicals. And then on the right there's an example of a photosynthetic or phototrophic microorganism that we recovered from some of these environments. So there's life in these unexpected places, and this means of science was able to give us access to these fascinating locations that we can't access normally. And it's sort of similar with prehistoric environments. We can't access those to photograph them. And so this is where scientific illustration comes in. I was always interested in color. Working with these microorganisms was fascinating, and how organisms interact with each other. And this is really nicely illustrated figuratively. And in this case, I've also illustrated it physically in this interaction between yuccas and yucca moths, which, as I mentioned, was the first system on which I worked. This mutualism, which is an interaction that in between two species of organisms in which both of them derive a net benefit from the interaction, is something that is that occurs in many places in nature. Here, for example, yucca moths are the obligate pollinators of yucca flowers. They have special anatomical evolutionary developments that help them to pollinate these flowers, and the yucca plants have no other way of pollinating themselves. So both derive a benefit. The moth gets a meal. It's sort of caterpillars, the larvae that it lays in these flowers next to the developing, which will be the developing seeds, get a meal from the developing seeds, but not all of them. So the yucca also gets pollination and therefore the ability to create a new generation of plants. Okay? So in that sense, both derive a benefit from this interaction. It's a pollination, seed predation, mutualism. And in sort of a similar way, we have a sort of a mutual benefit between science, and in this case, paleontology, and paleoart. Paleoart is absolutely, of course, require paleontological findings to be able to show our work, to inform our work, to make it maximally accurate. But then we're finding more and more that paleontologists these days are relying on paleoart to help to popularize their findings in journals, and then in public education formats like in museum exhibits. And of course, we also have other benefits, such as working in endeavors of biological conservation. All of these derive benefit from paleoart and, in general, scientific illustration, so that there's a greater sort of a visibility figuratively and literally here. And that also often translates into increased funding for more projects. Okay? So I will go into a few of the ways in which I use my work as a paleo artist to sort of contribute to these various endeavors, and go into some of these individually. And then I'll also talk about how I use science, and in this case specifically paleontology, to inform my artwork and to help me put together the various pieces that I do. So one of the most common kinds of projects I have is with individual researchers or teams of researchers to create these press release images for when their articles are published. And here's an example of Mimodactylus lebanensis, a new pterosaur that was described a few years ago in 2019 by Michael Caldwell and his team. And so here I've reconstructed this organism in what we would expect its natural environment to look like, in sort of an archipelago of islands. So this is very common for a lot of my work. It's a way to get around the problem that we can't go out and photograph these organisms, and instead I rely on the science from these experts to put together as realistic an image as possible of the organism when it was alive, and hopefully its environment as well. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to have my images appear on journal covers, and that's even nicer in many ways, both for myself as a paleo artist, because it gives me much more exposure, but also for the scientists who are doing the study that is highlighted on the cover, because of course, a lot more scientists, a lot more people in the scientific community and the public in general will get visibility of or we'll be able to see the research that's conducted in this particular way, and it's highlighted this way. So it, again, benefits everybody. One of my favorite types of projects is to be involved in museum exhibit development. And here it's really fun because I get to create reconstructions that are often life-sized for the dinosaurs or other organisms from the past, and to be able to try to imagine these things in a way and to depict them in a way that is maximally impactful for visitors to museums. Even nowadays, when it's a little bit harder to visit museums in person sometimes, there are ways that we can show people online as well, and very effectively, and through virtual reality. And some of these exhibits, like for the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County on the top left there, these Mementosaurus were nearly life-size. The opening of the Deep Time exhibit at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, which I had a great pleasure to be able to be involved in, involved the display of this, in some ways, larger than life-size foreground picture of a Carboniferous landscape that I painted for them, which also appears in the exhibit itself, actually. And then, of course, in the lower left there, you have a picture of a Devonian landscape or seascape that was commissioned by the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum right here, who's hosting this event today. And so this was a lot of fun to be able to create some of the exhibits for this museum as well. So I'll show you a couple of examples of pieces I've done for museums here. And this is, again, the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian. This is actually a portion of that same image as I showed you before, but this is actually in the museum. And it's a wonderful exhibit if you have a chance to go to Washington, D.C. to see it, because it's put together from a very large team of artists and scientists, curators, and they've done a beautiful job of highlighting not only the deep past, but how life and environment changes on Earth and the implications of climate change for our current biosphere as well. This is another example of some of the imagery for that exhibit, showing not just reconstructions of the past on Earth, such as this Torosaurus in an ancient environment in the Maastrichtian, but then also reconstructions of the past from, in this case, space. The impending asteroid that was going to hit the Yucatan, the now Yucatan Peninsula, that ended the Cretaceous period. And this is, again, from the same museum. We have a Paleogene landscape here on the left with a group of birds landing as well. And so a lot of these images are backdrops to the fossils in the foreground. And so it kind of allows you to look at the sort of the original fossil material as well as the reconstructions, and even the mechanics of flight here shown in a very interesting sort of Leonardo da Vinci-like way of a little mechanism with a portrait of some of the different animals that have used flight in the past, powered flight, pterosaurs and birds in the Cretaceous period. And so as I mentioned, I did a lot of the murals for the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum as well. So if you get a chance to visit, it's a wonderful museum. There's a lot of neat material in there, and some of it involves reconstructing a lot of Alberta landscapes in the past, mostly in the Cretaceous, but also in other times, like I showed previously, that Devonian seascape. And here we have a couple of the different ceratopsians that are on display in the museum at life size. And these ones here are in a well, rather large mural as well, actually, on the wall, showing them in sort of a natural environment, in this case, drinking at the shores of a Cretaceous lake. Another example of one of these murals from the museum here shows sort of, this was to show the food web of the time. So you have everything from the autotrophic plants. In some of the cases here, you can see magnolia relatives, as well as some of the taxodiaceous trees in the background, and the herbivores that fed on them, as well as some of the carnivores in the background that fed on those. In another image from the museum, from the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum, showing a forested landscape, showing Eotriceratops, which some of you may recognize who have been to the Tyrrell Museum and seen that wonderful giant skull on display as well. It's a huge, huge organism. And Edmontosaurus in the background there with that fascinating fleshy crest that was revealed back in 2009, I believe, or 2012 for Edmontosaurus regalis, as well as Ornithomimus. And then in addition to museum displays, I've done work with some national parks in the United States, for example. This is for Mammoth Cave National Park. And today, Mammoth Cave National Park is, of course, a cave. But back in the Mississippian, it was underwater and was home to a very diverse assemblage of chondrichthyans, or cartilaginous fish, which include sharks, rays, chimeras, and a lot of much more diverse organisms in the past than we've seen today. So this is a reconstruction of what that would have looked like in the past for that national park. In addition to that, I've done a lot of different books. I've illustrated books for both kids and adults. I do very much like illustrating books for kids and trying to make them as accurate as possible visually, because I appreciated that when I was a kid in the past. I loved to see as accurate reconstructions as possible. And I find it rewarding because kids today are going to grow up to be the scientists of tomorrow and the policymakers and the responsible citizens of tomorrow. And so we can never underestimate the importance, or sorry, we cannot never overestimate the importance of reaching out to youngsters today to interest them in science, to inspire them to care for this biosphere, because they're going to have a big impact on it tomorrow. They're our hope for the future. In addition to books, I've also had the pleasure to be able to illustrate stamps from various places. So this one here was in 2019. It was released at about the same time that the Time exhibit opened in Washington. And it shows several life stage reconstructions of a Tyrannosaurus, the nation's T-Rex, which is housed actually at the Smithsonian Institution. In addition to that, I've had the pleasure to work on a couple of different stamp sets in Canada here for Canada Post. There was the one in 2015 for a bunch of several different prehistoric animals. And then there was also one for the sharks of Canadian waters, which I also enjoyed because they also highlighted how important it is for us to conserve these organisms. And we have some wonderful sharks on our coasts. For some people who know, sharks are some of my other favorite animals besides dinosaurs in prehistoric life. So it was a huge excitement to work on this. And then I've had the chance to work on unusual kinds of projects with the Royal Canadian Mint, for example, to create coins, or to be able to design the images for these coins. One of the neat things was that the very first glow-in-the-dark coins were produced by the Royal Canadian Mint, and I had the chance to work on those ones. The upper left here is the Pachyrhinosaurus lacustae coin. Of course, as you are familiar at the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum, there's a wonderful bone bed of these organisms, and that species was discovered nearby. And so this was a coin that I painted in color, or designed in color for the life reconstruction, and then the skeleton would glow in the dark if it was charged with light. And so I and my wife, Alexandra Lafort, who's also a scientist, planetary scientist, we have both designed the various coins for the Royal Canadian Mint. And it's been a very fun thing to be able to work on these kinds of things where you have to focus on the opposite side, very tiny objects for the final product, as opposed to large life-size murals. So you have to think very differently about how to make things visible. And of course, as of last year, you can also now buy beer in southern Alberta through the Medicine Hat Brewing Company that has a design of a Thanatothuristes on it that I illustrated for them. It's the Reaper of Death beer, and here I kind of, in a fun way, incorporated a sort of an illusion of a skull on the front, using the hops plants that they asked me to add in there. Of course, it's not chronologically consistent to include hops here, but it was part of the design for the beer, and it's logical to include that. So that was an exceptionally unusual and fun kind of a project to work on. And another branch of my work is, in a way, much more directly sort of, I guess, beneficial or supportive of science. And I enjoy doing this because for me, supporting science and conservation is a very great passion of mine. I think that as a scientist, it is very much my responsibility to inspire people in an interest in science and to value the life that exists on Earth today so that we can preserve it for the future. And so I've been involved in various fundraising events by doing live paintings that are then auctioned off at the event. And I've done several of these for the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum while it was being built, so that funds could be raised by these large galas, for example, for fundraising, so that the museum could accrue some of the funding needed for it to be built in the first place. And so there were quite a few different paintings that I've done for these kinds of events, both at the Phil Currie Museum, the Vancouver Aquarium, and various other places, for example. And so, yeah, it's a fun kind of thing. And in some cases, you get other things as well happen. Like, of course, celebrities are invited to some of these events. So here we have Dan Aykroyd. He and his family were major contributors to the museum, to the Phil Currie Museum. And they were presented with Key to the Peace region, on which you can see there was a design of the Pachyrhinosaurus lacustae that I illustrated. So we get all sorts of fun kinds of interactions with various kinds of influential people as well. Recently, as of the onset of the pandemic, one actually sort of almost, you'd think counterintuitively, but a silver lining of this experience that we've all had to go through in the world has been the advancement of these platforms, of these virtual platforms like we're using now. This Zoom platform, for example, to allow us to interact virtually from all over the world much more easily. And this has allowed me to work with a lot of different organizations, conservation organizations, to interest kids in biological conservation by holding these kinds of learn to draw sessions in which I teach them how to draw a particular animal. And then during the session, we have experts and myself all discussing the biology of these organisms and the importance of their conservation and how people can become involved in that personally. And so this has been a wonderful means of outreach, and we've reached tens of thousands of people this way around the world. And we continue to do that with several organizations like Sierra Club BC, Sharks for Kids, and various others. And it's been a hugely wonderful experience for all of us involved. The other thing that I encourage people during these drawing sessions to do, and I have done myself, is to use illustration to sort of support the letters that we send to our policymakers in government, encouraging them to create policy that helps to protect various ecosystems on Earth. And so here, where I live here, for example, on the west coast of Canada, we have a big problem with the conservation of our old growth forests. And so I've written several letters to our various government officials to encourage the development of policy that will hopefully preserve as much of this as possible. We're seeing movement on it. So never be discouraged if you can. Try to remember that there are many success stories in conservation. And if we can, as artists, use our work to help promote this, I think that that's a very important responsibility for us. So I'm going to switch gears now. And so that was sort of a description of the ways in which I use illustration to contribute to various kinds of projects. Now I'm going to switch to talking about how paleontology has benefited my work. and how I use the science from paleontology to put together the images that I do. And so one of the things, this is an image actually from the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution, and it kind of nicely illustrates how various forms of science and art collaborate and bring together results and then reconstruct those results from many different fields to illustrate, to kind of reconstruct an entire environment, not just an individual organism. Of course, these all live together, and to show how the various plants and the herbivores and the detrivores and the carnivores all, I guess, earn benefit from their interactions. Sometimes not so much benefit if you're being eaten, but the carnivores need food too, so they gain a benefit from that. But how we are able to illustrate these entire food webs, for example, and how the meteorology and the geology all contributed to this as well, to make an environment that was truly alive at one time that we could have walked through. And my hope is to be able to illustrate it in such a way that it takes as much imagination out of this, and to be able to allow a person who's viewing this in an exhibit in a museum to be able to suspend disbelief as much as possible, to think that they're actually there. So we have nowadays the benefit of not relying on only bones to be able to reconstruct some of these ancient creatures, if we're talking about, say, vertebrates. Now there are some wonderful fossils of the impressions of scales of some of these animals, like this Brachylophosaurus that was shown in a Houston Museum of Natural Science exhibit featuring this famous Brachylophosaurus called Leonardo. It had its muscles preserved in 3 dimensions, its scales from various parts of its body, different sizes and distributions of scales and textures. And we were able to look at those, and I could then reconstruct the organism in its life stage. In this case, actually, it's dead on the shore, having been deposited, but as it looked when it was alive. Sorry, this keeps advancing automatically. And also, as I'll get into in a second, the gut contents were able to inform us about, and this is true for many organisms for which we have wonderful fossils, about the environments in which they lived and what they ate. It's just fascinating what information is available nowadays to reconstruct some of these organisms and their environments. And so it makes it a lot easier for some of us as paleo artists to work, especially when we have the benefit of working with experts who have studied these and who have gleaned so much amazing information from these fossils. So here's another mural actually that appears in the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum, showing a seascape and shows here a Tylosaurus chasing some Ichthyodectes fish and some ammonites in the background, and some Alberta nectes, elasmosaurs or plesiosaurs. And here we can see that some of these organisms actually have, again, as I mentioned before, the impressions of scales preserved. So now we know a lot more about how mosasaurs looked, for example, like this Tylosaurus, and not just their scales, but some of their soft tissues overall in larger scale, such as the caudal fin, that extension on top of the tail there, which is something that was described not too long ago in many marine vertebrates, such as mosasaurs, and also even in elasmosaurs or plesiosaurs. There is a suggestion for some of these soft tissues, and so we can tell that they were evolved for effective life in a marine environment with these highly propulsive tails. So fascinating work that paleontology gives us to reconstruct some of these organisms. Now, in some cases, we're really lucky because we can actually observe we can look at sort of what prehistoric humans illustrated as Paleolithic art. So these were some of the original paleo artists, so to speak, but in that time, it would have been plein air art. Artwork created from directly viewing their environment. And we can see that some of the pigments they used created images that are consistent from one to the other. And we can then conclude with high degree of confidence that they were reconstructing the images with probably accurate color markings, for example. So we can tell that step bison had this sort of reddish coat with black markings along the margins, for example. And so it makes our paleo art informed by prehistoric peoples who did life paintings in the past. It's a fascinating kind of a thing to be able to interact across millennia with people in that way. In addition to that, we have, of course, as many people know, some beautiful feather impressions from dinosaurs, of course, linking dinosaurs and birds. underscoring the fact that birds evolved directly from theropods. And not only do we have beautiful feather impressions, like for the ornithomimids that I reconstructed for Darla Zelenitsky and her team, which had the wonderful plume-like feathers and these for probably wonderful displays using their arms, but also, as was found a little bit later, these microscopic structures of melanosomes that contained pigment called melanin in forms like eumelanin and pheomelanin that then allow us to say something about the distribution and the tones, at least, of some dinosaur feathers and skin, such as the black, sort of iridescent, so partial structural coloration as well, feathers of Microraptor, or the pheomelanin present in the tail in stripes in Sinosauropteryx, for example. And in some cases, I've actually had to update my work based on some of these new scientific findings that inform us about the color patterns, or at least the tone variation of dinosaurs. We don't have all of the pigments preserved, of course. There are some wonderful exceptions to that, but we can say something about the tones. And whereas my original artwork of Anchiornis huxleyi, a wonderful little dinosaur from China that was described in, I think, 2009, I kind of had a speculative coloration pattern for it. But then a year later, this wonderful paper by Lee and colleagues in collaboration with Jacob Vintner came out with an actual map of the color pattern, or at least the tone pattern of this organism based on the distribution of melanosomes across it, and the analysis of pheomelanin versus eumelanin that gave different hues of it as well. And then I could update my artwork to be more consistent with the findings of this animal's color pattern. So now we have a much better understanding of what this organism looked like, both in terms of its soft tissue in the form of feathers, as well as how it probably would have looked in terms of its color map. So it's fascinating. I love to work with scientists this way. Now, we don't always have this information, of course. We sometimes do have to guess as paleoartists at the color of animals in the past. And this is where I enjoy drawing on my background as an ecologist, in which I studied many different kinds of ecosystems and the biological communities that lived in them, and how animals and plants communicate using color. In many cases, you can see beautiful examples of this in the wild, such as I have 4 here that show how color is used by animals in crypsis, in cryptic coloration, which allows them to hide from their enemies, from their predators, or from their prey, so they can sneak up on them. And so you can see here, for example, a mantis that is hanging out on a flower, and it's colored and shaped very much like a flower. So it's very easy to overlook that. Or this lizardfish that I photographed in Hawaii that mimics the kinds of patterns of refraction of caustics that occur underwater when light is refracted through the waves on the surface, and you have these stripes and patterns of light that appear on corals, and that the fish can therefore hide effectively when it lines itself up with some of these kinds of patterns. Various fish like leafy sea dragons here, which is a weird type of seahorse, also have these beautiful stripes of blue and green, which work really well when it lives in an environment of, for example, seagrasses, which have a lot of these similar kinds of repetitions of blue and green, the blue in the background of the water and the green in the plants that are in the foreground. So it can hide really well from its predators. And in addition, you have these kinds of interesting wattles and various kinds of projections from it that help it to hide by using its physical morphology to resemble its background. And of course, in forest environments, you have okapis these days that are colored with these stripes, again, resembling the kinds of patterns that sunlight makes on the surface of objects as it's filtered through the canopy above. A lot of stripes and blotches that end up making the okapi look relatively invisible in a darker forested environment that has sunlight filtering through it. So of course, we see that animals use this today, and there's no reason to think that they didn't in the past also use similar strategies to hide. So I've incorporated those kinds of ideas in a lot of the artwork that I've done of dinosaurs, for example. So here are a couple of small ceratopsians, UNESCO-ceratops and Gryphoceratops from southern Alberta that I illustrated for Michael J. Ryan. And here we have them again in forest environment, and I've used some of these kinds of stripes and splotchy patterns to show that, you know, these small animals, which would have been susceptible to predation by larger predators, would have had to probably hide in their environment. And so using patterns and tones that would have helped them, and hues to help them to blend into the background, would be effective. But there's another element to consider here, and that animals, and this is beautifully illustrated by birds today, don't always use color just to hide. Birds in breeding plumage exemplify how animals can use color, brilliant color, to stand out, sort of in a, treading teleologically on the idea deliberately, evolutionarily deliberately in a sense. The point is to make them more visible to their mates and to show that, if I can survive this well in an environment with predators, but showing up this brightly, then maybe I'm a pretty good potential mate. So it's an advertising of sort of a fit animal of healthy genetics to be able to survive in the presence of predators, but brilliantly colored. So here you can see an example of that, maybe in the lower jaw of this Gryphoceratops. Maybe it's in a breeding coloration, and it's showing off to its potential mates that it can survive despite this brilliant blue color. And blue color, by the way, is something that you might have expected in dinosaurs, in the sense that you have birds using structural color, which makes use of refraction and of light passing through layers with very, very small spaces between reflecting surfaces that then scatter light of particular wavelengths, and blue is a common one. You see that on blue jays, for example. That blue color on the feathers is a result directly of structural coloration. It's not pigment based. Okay, and then of course there's an interesting concept of animals using bright color to actually blend into their background. We see this a lot in some lizards today, as well as birds, but you think of the kakapo, for example, in New Zealand. But here we see it commonly in day geckos. So for example, this is in Hawaii. We have a couple of species of Phelsuma day gecko. And when you look at it not in its natural environment, like here climbing on a rusted metal fence, it sticks out like a sore thumb. And any predator could be able to pick this up very easily if it has, let's say, color vision. But when you put it into its natural environment, on leaves, in this case of Pandanus, well, it from a distance, it would disappear. You'd have to look closely to see that. And even you can see some of the bright red that you might find on them is not out of place, because this Pandanus plant has this brightly russet colored stripes on it as well. So you can see how even bright colors selected carefully by a paleoartist can make sense in the right kind of environment. In other cases, of course, and here again, sort of remembering the kakapo in New Zealand, this green-colored parrot, some wonderful footage of them. They're adorable and require a lot of conservation. So if you can contribute to that, then kudos to you. This here is a picture of Meilong that I reconstructed. Meilong, of course, is that small troodontid dinosaur that was found preserved in a position, actually two fossils, in a position that resembles what birds adopt when they're sleeping today, with their head tucked behind their wing and their tail wrapped around. Well, tail wrapped around in this case because it had a longer tail. Birds don't usually wrap their tail around themselves, but this animal may well have, it looks like it died by possibly asphyxiation from carbon dioxide from a volcanic eruption. Perhaps it was caught while asleep. In any case, I have illustrated green here with speckling of black to suggest that maybe these animals could have used crypsis in this way to hide in plain sight, even in many cases. And of course, that would be very important if you're sleeping. And if you're a ground-dwelling animal as opposed to arboreal, you'd want to be able to hide while asleep and while you're not protected. And this could be accomplished in this case by green pigments. We have biliverdin, which was preserved from the fossil record in the eggs of some dinosaurs, some oviraptorosaur dinosaurs, for example. So we know blues and greens were something that they could have produced in those days, or the presence of mosses or algae in this case. Let's say if we wanted to say that algae also can color the fur of certain animals like sloths, for example. So it's possible that maybe algae was involved in some cases as well to color dinosaur feathers. Who knows? This is, again, where interesting paleontological research could show in the future possible remnants of some of these. I don't know. There's a lot to be discovered. In some cases, of course, I mentioned dinosaurs may have used more brilliant colors. This is I mean, this is speculative, of course, but anyway, an example in Gorgosaurus that I painted. This is an example of one of those that was a live acrylic painting for one of the live painting events at one of the galas for the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum fundraisers, and this was auctioned off after the event. So this took a few hours to paint on a canvas, And this shows a Gorgosaurus with relatively more brilliant colors, sort of a bright blue, maybe in a sort of a breeding plumage. Again, it could be structural color in this case. And so I'm an ecologist by initial training, and what really gets my engine turning is the excited is the ability to reconstruct entire environments, not just isolated animals or plants, but to try to reconstruct a whole environment, a whole biological community at a time, to give us an idea of what it might have looked like. And so this is where I have a lot of fun working with groups of experts: paleontologists, paleobotanists, paleoclimatologists, people who have knowledge from various fields, to be able to put all of this together and then sort of really kind of take the cream off the surface of all of these studies. I feel very lucky to still have that ability to work with scientists, even though I'm an artist now, and to put together an image from all of these sources that uses all of this wonderful research knowledge. And so here we have an example from from Oxford, showing Megalosaurus bucklandi in its natural environment. And we have various plants that are also preserved from that environment, like this Tylophyllum, Elaticulatus, a type of conifer, for example. And all of these are put together in the sort of this wet type of environment in which it likely lived. And we end up with a reconstruction that hopefully approximates as closely as possible the environment in which it actually did live. And then there was this really fun project that you will probably have seen, that wonderful preserved, one of the best preserved dinosaurs in the world, that was described as Borealopelta Mitchellii in 2020 by Caleb Brown and his team. And so it is that the Suncor Nodosaur that was recovered, that's kind of go ahead there, from northern Alberta, from near Fort McMurray, and it was so well preserved in 3 dimensions that even its gut contents were preserved. And from that, we could tell not just from the matrix around it, but from within its guts, what plants it ate from within this environment. And so I was able to put a lot of these different plants into the reconstruction. And we also kind of used this illustration to show what the animal ate by having it, to show it with a mouthful of these particularly selected plants. And so here is the final illustration and again, this was a press release image for when the article was published. And it showed a fascinating environment in the early Cretaceous that looked like it was a fire influenced environment, because it was rich in ferns, which is one of the characteristics of a secondary succession after fires. Ferns are very good at growing in afterwards. And this is something that anybody who studied the KPG impact event and the recovery of the Earth after the impact of the Chicxulub asteroid, that ferns, there's a fern layer, there's a lot of ferns that occurred initially afterwards. And so we have a lot of ferns. This organism actually selected ferns for most of its diet. And so we see that in the gut contents compared to sort of the plants and the matrix surrounding it. And in addition to that, there was also a lot of pieces of charcoal in the guts of the animal, which suggests that as it was munching on these ferns, grazing these low-lying plants, it ingested accidentally some of the burned remains of plants from before the current cohort of plants that died in the fire. And so here's an example of reconstructing not just the environment of the animal, not just the animal, but its environment, but also the kinds of process that took place, like fire, for example. So that was a lot of fun. Another example here showing this tetrapedophis amplectus, which I actually had a lot of fun because I was the illustrator who reconstructed the very first time that it was described in 2015, when it was thought to be a 4-legged snake. But recently, last year, Michael Caldwell and his team redescribed it not as a snake, but as a dolichosaur, a relative of snakes, of course, but more closely of mosasaurs. And it was a small 4-legged animal, very, very small. And we wanted to underscore this. Dr. Caldwell wanted to underscore this by showing it in an environment in which we can compare it with small animals. And so here, for example, it is in an aquatic environment compared to very small distilled fish, as well as, the Dortenia is a very unusual conifer. So this is branches of it that have fallen and are hanging into the water. Again, a bit small branches, so you can see how small this animal was compared to it. And a Belostomatidae family water bug. So again, these are large water bugs, but as animals go, it's still small. So it's larger in size actually than the thickness of this tiny reptile. So again, we're able to show this from the Crato Formation in Brazil, an unusual kind of environment and a very small, fascinating four-legged organism that had very small legs that were quite nearly vestigial. And of course, in some cases, we're able to look at material that is so recent that it's only partially fossilized. So here, I've worked with a wonderful team, actually, in this case with Grant Zazula and Julie Meechan, on a fascinating discovery of a baby wolf from a den that preserved in its den that probably collapsed. Sad day for the little wolf puppy. Back in the Yukon. And this was only a few thousand years ago now. And so we're able to use a lot of information from looking at the animals that were preserved in that area, and as well as known from studies of these similar kinds of wolf dens that would have occurred at the same time. So we're able to put together this reconstruction of the wolf puppy, known as Jure, as given the name Jure, when it was alive in its den, chewing on fish. And this was also another fascinating bit of its ecology, in that a stable isotope analysis of the remains showed that this population of wolves likely relied a lot on catching salmonid fish from the streams in the area. And so here we've able to show some of that behavior as well, and some of the trophic interactions, therefore. And so again, Paleoart is helpful into putting together a story, basically, not just of the animal with which it lived and its den structure, but also, in this case, the plants. So we've included several different plants, such as the wonderful tussock cotton grasses that were common at that time in that environment. This was, again, several thousand years ago. In this case, quite a few thousand years ago, several tens of thousands of years ago, but still relatively recent, geologically speaking. And so, yeah, I enjoy doing not just dinosaurs, of course, but mammals as well. And again, bringing it back to the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum, one of the murals in the museum shows a group of Pachyrhinosaurus lacustae crossing a river during a particularly intense storm. And as you may know, there's this wonderful bone bed of these dinosaurs, of Pachyrhinosaurus, which is one of the whole reasons for this museum to exist in the first place. And it's relatively nearby. And the idea here is that these guys could well have perished in, say, a flooding event where the river was much more powerfully flowing than normal because of the influx of precipitation, and several of them didn't make it across the river and died, and it washed them together into a large bone bed, which became fossilized and now is able to inform scientists wonderfully. And of course, in addition to smaller scale events, well, large scale from the point of view of those Pachyrhinosaurs that had a very bad day, but small scale, but larger scale in a geological sense, there are other kinds of events that are interesting, and where Paleoart is the only way we can illustrate some of these kinds of things. We can't photograph them directly. So, for example, the Shukalub impact, or in this case, in the upper left here, sorry, it keeps advancing automatically. In the upper left here is a group of chondrichthyans, sharks in this case, just before the impact of the KT impactor at the end of the Mesozoic, 66 million years ago. You can see in the sky, actually, oops, sorry, I navigated away. In the sky, you can see several meteor strikes burning through the atmosphere. Not strikes, meteors burning through the atmosphere. In the distance is also the asteroid approaching. This is just before. This was done for a team by Nicholas Campione and Bazzi and others for a study on the change in the chondrichthyan populations before, or communities before and after that impact. So fascinating research again. Again, in the middle there at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, we have some great visuals showing how volcanoes were involved in the end of the Permian, for example. The largest mass extinction known on Earth occurred at a time when there was a massive outpouring of volcanic energy that changed the climate of the Earth in a catastrophic way. And we're actually seeing, oddly, some parallel events today with rapid climate change on Earth. And we can use this as a lesson of how badly things can go sometimes. And then, of course, we'll get to that in a second. And the lower right here was a fun image I did for Steve White's book on my artwork, showing a scene from 108 million years ago. If you look at the moon today, you'll see the only crater that you can really see with the naked eye is the Tycho impact crater. And it is on the edge of the moon from our point of view, and it occurred about 108 million years ago. So at that time, there were prehistoric animals on Earth, and this is a Thalassodromeus pterosaur flying in the southern hemisphere over Brazil. And when this happened, it would have been really impressive to see, because you can see the ejecta rays where the sediment landed, or the regolith landed after the impact blew it off the surface. But during the impact, it would have been brilliant impact to see. It would have been amazing. So again, showing an interesting combination of astronomy as well as paleontology there. So okay, finally getting to this here. Wiki wanted to show herself very much. This is the most famous dog in paleo art, I reckon. Wiki is actually a model for some of my work, or she has posed for me in the past. She's around here today. She's recovering from a bit of dental surgery yesterday. She's 18 years old now. She's still in super shape, and she's been my assistant in some of these endeavors of paleo art. And you can see she's one of the critical components that are needed for paleo art to be done properly. And this is, of course, in the background is also some of the instruments I work with to create some of these works digitally, directly using a stylus on an interactive LCD display. And so here I'm going to go through, play a sort of a time lapse of one of these images. This is the cover image for the book by Steve White on my artwork. And you can see as it advances, this is an example of sort of the traditional artwork sort of style of digital painting that I do, where I use the stylus like I would an acrylic brush, and or to apply acrylic paint. And you can see as it moves along how the background changes and the foreground changes as I add various components. And then it nears completion, and you can see that it's populated by dinosaurs, Spinops and Coronosaurus, and an Albertosaurian Tyrannosaur, as well as Montana Darko in the background, and the various plants that would have existed at the time in this environment. Now it's complete here, and so you can see how it progressed from beginning to end, and that's an example of how it works, basically. So that's all I've got to say here for now. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Again, many thanks to the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum team for inviting me, and I am happy to take any questions from the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
It was really cool to see your artwork in progress, that last screen.
Yeah, I can load that again, and just if you wanted to, while we talk here.
Yeah, but yeah, so we're gonna open it up to the question period, and through the talk, you already have a few questions popped up. So the first one is, how many layers do you go through in a single painting or drawing?
That's a good question. It varies a lot. Now, of course, I work both with traditional artwork, with sort of corporeal media, as I like to call it, like the real media as opposed to digital, not real in the sense. In those cases, of course, it's a single layer, but I have to work up from the bottom up. And I do that either by applying sort of darker colors first and then lighter colors after, usually. But if I do it digitally, I do make use of the fact that I'm able to work on several layers back and forth, and it doesn't have to all be one layer. And so in that case, it ranges from just a few, if it's a very quick image, and sometimes I enjoy sort of blending different layers together, to in some cases hundreds of them. So I usually try to label the layers, but sometimes I forget and it just ends up showing up as layer number such and such, and it's been up to over 200 in some cases. And so this is useful because I can then create layers of individual types of vegetation and individual animals, which can then be extracted and used by, let's say, the museum for which I painted it as spot art for other parts of the museum to highlight certain animals or plants that are components of the image, but not with all the background as well. So yeah, it can be up to hundreds of these layers. Anyway, so that's a bit of a ramble about that in general.
That's cool. So the next question is, what medium do you use? Are all the murals hand painted, or do you use software?
Right, that's sort of partly answered that one already. There's three sort of major ways that techniques that I use. One of them is the traditional artwork, which means that I pick up a pencil or a pen or various kinds of media in paint. I like to use acrylic a lot because it is so malleable in laying layers on top of each other repeatedly, which is good for changing things. Acrylic is one of them that way, but I also, so that's one of the ways, right? So that's traditional media. I don't have as many projects with those these days, although I do have a few. The other way is digital, and my digital techniques are two major types. One of them involves, like you see here with this mastodons mostly. Again, this was a painting of American mastodons that I did for the Yukon-Burinji Interpretive Center for Grant Zazula's team. Most of this is actually painted using the stylus and LCD tablet, but using the stylus like I would a paintbrush by selecting a color and applying it stroke by stroke. And I really enjoy that process because I love just painting and I love traditional painting. But in addition to that, the other technique that I use is photographic compositing, so I've got a library of about 1/3 of a million photographs that I've taken around the world. So wherever I go traveling, I take photos of interesting environments or of animals and plants that I encounter. And then I make this library that I can use to extract images from, and then include those images in a developing artwork, and then modify them as necessary to make them agree with the anatomy of a prehistoric organism. So it's not like I can just plunk an animal in from today, or or a particular plant, unless it's the same genus, for example. In this case, in this image here, you can see some of the spruce in the background, some of the black spruce and white spruce are the same species that exist today. So I can actually use some of those, and some of those ones did originate as photographs. Whoopsie, here it goes again. But I don't, and sometimes I use all of those techniques together. So I've used sort of traditional pieces which I've scanned or photographed to add as components of an image. And in this case here, I've used some photographic elements which then I modify those some of the trees in the background, but I also paint them directly on using that sort of painting approach. The mastodons are done that way, as well as the Labrador tea plants in the bottom there. So it's a combination of different techniques that I use. And I also sometimes do three-dimensional digital modeling, which I've used to incorporate into my two-dimensional paintings by creating textures, or I'll create physical clay models of textures of let's say dinosaur scales, which I'll photograph under proper lighting conditions, and then I'll use those photographs and extracted textures and use that to paint the animal's texture. So it's a combination of many different techniques that I usually combine into a single image, and that usually ends up being the most effective way.
Okay, that was a lot more types than I was expecting.
Yes, it's a few, yeah, and it's a lot of fun that way, because you really have to be creative in figuring it out. Like, for example, those the very plumulous display of that ornithomimid that I did, the wing feathers over the ornithomimid for Darla Zelenitsky's reconstruction. I actually bought a feather duster for that, made of ostrich feathers, and then I photographed the feathers and then modified them as needed and put them together into a model. And then, photographed the model, which I then modified digitally as well to create a reconstruction of a feather display on the arms of the animal. So again, creation, modification of, or a combination of models and digital components.
That is really fun. So the next question we have is, what's the best way to get involved with museums to create artwork for exhibits?
It's been an interesting sort of process for me. In some cases, museums will advertise that they're, that they would, yeah, they don't usually advertise directly. I have approached some museums initially to suggest kinds of interesting things to do. That's one of the ways. And that's actually how I got started in the beginning. I approached the Canadian Museum of Nature about some of the artwork. And it was actually some curious questions about the artwork on one of their, an online natural history sort of display of various Canadian animals. And then they got in touch with me about that, and that they were doing some updates. And so they were interested if I was interested to do that. So sometimes approaching them helps. And then, of course, word of mouth. So once you've got a few of these kinds of projects out, and usually it involves bidding against others who are also invited to bid for a project. And then so the museum will contact you in some cases for that. And if you win it, if you win the bid and are able to finish the project, then of course that is all advertising for you as well. Once that museum's exhibit is up, there are thousands or millions of people who see it, and then that's a good way to advertise as well. And of course, museums will, in many cases, include a credit, and this is important for you to suggest it as well, that they include a credit to the artist. And then that will allow other museums representatives who are traveling around and seeing examples of museum exhibits to see some of the people that are involved in producing these, and that helps to spread the word as well. So it's a long process. It's not sudden. You have to have a lot of patience with it. For me, it took several years for this to build up. But word of mouth that way helps a lot. And then, of course, advertising on a website is super important if you can. And so those are the main ways that I've found to be effective in either approaching museums, or more likely it's from word of mouth, or seeing existing exhibits and such, and advertising online with a website.
Yeah, thanks, Julius. I actually have a question as well.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how much artistic license you're typically given by the researchers that you work with, and if you ever have conflicts about what you think and what they think, and how you resolve those.
That's an interesting question, actually. That way, I've been very lucky, actually. I consider myself, because I don't like a situation where I would have conflicts about ideas, because I know how uncomfortable that could be, or I can imagine how comfortable that would be to have to do something that you really don't suspect would be the case. But then I have to remember, I'm a paleo artist, and even though I am a scientist, I'm not a paleontologist, so I'm not an expert there. And for me, that's actually been beneficial, because I can much more reasonably defer to their expertise, and for good reason. They have a heck of a lot more expertise than I do. There has been a couple of examples where I did have to advocate for a particularly different reconstruction. And there was a good example of a reconstruction of a shark that I did, a living shark, actually, a basking shark, in which the author had a problem with the way that I depicted where the openings to the gill slits occurred on the inside of the mouth, and how far forward they were compared to the gill slits on the external side of the animal, and how it didn't look like they lined up properly. But then I explained to them, and this was a general ichthyologist. So again, it shows that expertise in an area is very important, because a general scientist may not have as much understanding about a particular field. And I was particularly informed about these sharks, so it actually helped me to make this reconstruction. And in arguing for the correct reconstruction, showing those openings further forward, because there's a long distance over which the water passes over the gill rakers and the gill filaments that is between the inner and outer tissues. And so once I explained that, the editor was like, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. And so they, of course, went with that. But again, it has to do with defending a point of view with rigorous information. And that is the whole basis of science. And if that can be done, if the researchers or the experts with which I'm working can do that for anything that I find to be maybe questionable, of course I'll accept it. And that's the beauty of science. We use critical thinking and well supported arguments to be able to make these kinds of conclusions, and then we can then reason between each other to come up with something that works well. So I've never actually had a big problem with any of the researchers I've worked with. Editors and general writers, in some cases, I've had a couple of these, but it's always been resolved nicely that way. In terms of the artistic license for some of the reconstructions, yeah, there's going to be some guesswork for sure. And in these situations, a lot of the time, the experts that I work with defer to me for some of the stuff that they don't know about. So for example, in some cases, the fur patterns or fur colors of some animals where really it isn't known, of some prehistoric mammals, for example. In some cases, there are good ideas, and then they will give me those. And I try to rely on as much of the well-established or plausible or parsimonious ideas that exist. But that's not always the case. And in the cases when there isn't, then I go back to my own ecological background and try to make the best educated guess, the most parsimonious argument for, let's say, the color of feathers or fur that might be expected in a particular environment, and not just in a general geographical area, but the particular microenvironment in which this organism lived, the one it frequented the most, or where it would have the greatest impact from predators or so on. So there is artistic license because we don't have all of the components of a lot of these animals. In some cases, it's only a small portion of a bone. But again, as you know as well, you can use what's called phylogenetic bracketing to help to give us a good example or a good idea of maybe if we know the characteristics of a particular set of relatives that of an organism, of a group of these, then we can infer with some degree of confidence about maybe the conservation of some of these traits in an organism that is related to them. And so that I use that as well, phylogenetic bracketing, to help to make the most realistic guess at what some of these traits may have been like.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, so next question is, what's the longest reconstruction that you've done?
Like the longest time-wise, I guess, that took?
Presumably, yeah.
Right. Some of these, so they range in length, and some of them are like, can you get this done to us, within a week or some. In some cases, a sketch within a day, for example. That's limited because in some cases, there's going to be a trade-off between quality and duration. But in some cases, I've had to reconstruct entire ecosystems in large murals. And those ones take a lot longer, of course, because we're looking at large sizes, a ton of different details, and many organisms usually within them as well. And so some of these ones include, for example, at the Royal Ontario Museum for the Ultimate Dinosaurs Giants from Gondwana exhibit. There were several of these large murals that ranged in size from about maybe 18 meters to 30 or 40 meters in length, and were about 5 meters tall. And for those ones, any one of these can take several months to complete. And that's important, therefore, that museums, when they have these projects, they get to you as early as possible, because of course the trade-off between quality and quantity, or quality of the image versus the quantity of work that goes into it, is very much a trade-off between them. So if you have several months to work on something, that of course helps. And those ones had taken several months to do at that size. And then also not just because they're large, but because you want to leave enough time for the back and forth review and revision that takes place when the experts, and often large teams of experts of different fields, have to review it and then offer their feedback to make corrections. I'm still learning. I'm not an expert in all these fields either. And of course, there's going to be a lot of revision that takes place. Less now than in the past, but you need time for that to fit into everybody's schedule. So the length of time that an image takes is influenced not just by the amount of work that goes into the actual artwork, the actual physical laying down of the pigments, but also the schedule of the teams involved for review and for editing it and so on.
Okay, next question. What advice do you have for aspiring paleoartists for creating accurate work when it is not being overlooked directly by paleontologists?
Oh yeah, that's a good question actually, because yeah, sure. Paleontologists are often very approachable, and they love to talk about their work, amazingly enough, which we find out a lot when we attend SVP meetings or Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meetings, which I do, or other types of conferences, and that's a lot of fun. It's great to network, and that's one of the things actually I do recommend is network with paleontologists. But if you don't have access to the expertise of a paleontologist, then the way to do that is you go to the primary scientific literature. So the fortunate thing is that nowadays there are ever more journal articles that are open access now, which means that they aren't behind a paywall. You can access them for free without a subscription to a journal. And so if you look at some really useful scientific search engines like bio1.org, those ones will allow you to select your searches or filter your searches by open access only. So in those cases, you know that you'll be able to access the material without a subscription, which of course makes it a lot easier to use that. And so you can then look at original scientific publications that talk about the subject you're interested in illustrating. And that's very important to access this material rather than relying on just others' work, other reconstructions, or the popular press. And there are some wonderful scientific blogs out there. I know that I really love the writing of Riley Black, for example. She works in various ones like Scientific American and stuff. I've seen some great, and Smithsonian Magazine. But there are also a lot of blogs or other writings that aren't accurate, that don't take care at making accurate analyses of the writings. And so it's always important to rely on the original scientific manuscripts themselves. And so yeah, do that, definitely. And then of course, if you can, talk to paleontologists, because they are a lot more approachable than a lot of people think.
Thanks. I hope that helped our question answer. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions come up, so I've got one more that we ask all of our speakers, and that's, what's your favorite dinosaur?
I knew that was going to be that is the most common question I get, and I was waiting for that to show up, but it's a good one. It's a great one. It's a fun one. So, and it's also and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to try to patronize you by suggesting that I knew the question would come up, but it's a fun one. It's a great one to talk about, and it's one that does come up a lot. So I have a hard time answering that one, because as a biologist, one of the things that motivates me the most, one of the things that gives me the most passion about biology, is the diversity of organisms on the planet. The diversity of not just organisms, but of systems, whole entire communities of organisms and ecosystems. So it's really hard for me to pick a favorite. I don't have a single favorite, in all honesty. And the more I study them, the less I have any particularly favorite group. But there are a few that really do hold a dear place, or hold a place in my heart, sort of. Partly because of how weird they are. I'm very attracted to weirdness when it comes to prehistoric life and living organisms. And so the stranger they are, the more interesting. So let's say, I mean, I do enjoy the theropods a lot. I think there's something about their elegance and their, the ability to balance on two legs. It just really, their balance is beautiful. I like that somehow. Among theropods, there are a few groups that stand out as fascinating to me, and one of them that has always stood out as really interesting. And tyrannosaurids are great. I think they're one of my favorite groups. I love them. But in addition to tyrannosaurids, there are the abelisaurids, and the abelisaurids are just weird, funky little, they're small to large animals actually. So they had a few interesting features like those really weird stumpy arms, which were so much smaller, proportional to their size than even many Tyrannosaurus arms, and less well developed bones. And so, for example, like the radius and ulna, and some of them were almost lacking. It's like the hands are pinned onto a humerus almost. It's wild, and yet 4 fingers on some of them. So lots of fingers and really stumpy little arms, really weird, really neat. Big, massive tails, wide tails. Some interesting work by Scott Person's teams, for example, on the size of the muscles in their tails of like Carnotaurus. Really massive, interesting that way. And their faces, the huge diversity of the ornamentation on their faces, their skull structure suggests that they had some very interesting skin textures and integument texture in general on their faces. Some of them had horns, like Carnotaurus, for example, had 2 horns, one over each brow, or Majungasaurus, that single horn at the back of the skull on top. Others had a very interesting, highly rugose face. For example, Rugops is a good example of one. And so those are interesting to me because of not just the diversity within the group, but also the weirdness of the group in many ways. So unusual traits, and not all of it is well understood yet. And even if it is, and once it is, it's still fascinating because it's interesting. It generates interesting stories of biology to be able to explain why some of these weird features existed, for example. So yeah, I guess if I had to pick a favorite group, that would be one of them, I'd say. Other than that, I'd have to say that there's a lot of favorites.
Yeah, we get that. There's so many cool species. It's really hard to narrow it down to one or two.
Yeah. And Trypanosaurids, and oh my goodness, just any of the weird sharks and the shark elephants. Oh, it's just Helicoplanet. Oh man, I could go on for hours about some of this stuff, but then of course, so could a lot of the audience and you guys. So.
Well, I think that's where we're going to end it. Not seeing any other questions come in, so I just want to thank you again. It was so great having you present.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I had a lot of fun. I always enjoy show and tell of my work and how fun it is to work with the paleontological community. So I hope that this will continue, and I just look forward to a lot of this. And again, the work I do, and I very much encourage paleo artists and scientific artists in general to also put as much effort as you can into conservation initiatives. This world is really something we need to save, and our work can help it. So I'll leave it at that. So thank you so much.
Again, thank you for coming in. To our audience, we'd like you to stay tuned to our social media accounts, where we'll be announcing our next speaker series when we determine who that, we'll finalize the details about that. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.